Today we have some more actual history about the western frontier of Texas around the time of the Civil War. This story took place near Mason, Texas, all the way back in 1863, when Comanches caught sight of little Alice Todd's red gold hair, which they heavily prized. We will be reading a story from the spring 1961 issue of Frontier Times magazine, titled Comanche Captive, by William C.X. Hancock, illustrated by B.J. McCausey. So here is the tragic story of Alice Todd and her family, which begins in Fredericksburg, Texas in the late 1850s. John Todd halted his covered wagon in front of a trading post in Fredericksburg, the outermost German settlement in the Lipan Apache Hill Country of central Texas, and with 6-year-old daughter Alice and 3-year-old son Johnny holding on to his hands, entered to purchase some supplies. They encountered a band of 6 Indian braves preparing to leave through the back door. These were much the biggest Indians John had ever seen. In spite of their gay feathers, bright paint, and shiny bracelets and earrings, these Indians looked as fierce as eagles. Each warrior carried a wicked-looking scalping knife in addition to his bow and arrows. All paused a moment and stared at Alice's red gold hair, then strode from the store with an arrogant manner. "Act like they're lords of the plains," said John. "As indeed they are," smilingly said the storekeeper, in cultured English traced with a slight German accent. "They call themselves Nina, which means live people. White men call them Comanches." "Comanches!" exclaimed John. "It's Comanche country we're headed for, the part Ranger Scouts call San Saba land." "I know," said the trader, "a wondrous country between the Llano and San Saba rivers. The Comanche name for this region means happy hunting ground, and the sub-tribesmen inhabiting it are enviously called Panatecas, or honey-eaters by other Indians. But you haven't a chance in the world to make it there alone, especially since those bucks just in here took in your little girl's reddish hair, which they highly treasure as a token of good fortune. You better join a wagon train which has been forming here and must be about ready to start for your promised land." John followed this advice. Next morning he found his wagon a part of a train headed almost due north toward the upper reaches of the Llano. As the travelers approached San Saba land, game became most unbelievably abundant. No longer was there any necessity for hunting meat. It was now merely a matter of shooting whatever game was desired along the trail. The country teemed with deer, antelope, and wild turkeys. Black bears, spooked by the noise of the train, scurried up the mountainsides. Hordes of ownerless black cattle racketed through the thickets, and herds of buffalo and wild mustangs were constantly in view. The lead wagon had reached the Llano crossing when the driver sighted dust clouds to the west. "Indians! Form a circle with the wagons!" he bellowed, waving his hat in an arc. The word was passed down the line. Water barrels and household goods were dragged out and made into breastworks. The men crouched behind this barricade while the women sat nearby on the ground to reload for them. At this critical moment the oncoming horsemen topped a slight rise, and the travelers saw a detachment of Federal cavalry approaching. The entire camp sighed with relief. The troop cantered up and halted. The young officer commanding dismounted and introduced himself as Lieutenant Stewart. Alice darted out from her father's wagon and executed a charming curtsy for him. "Hello, Goldilocks," said the officer as he bent down to one knee and held out his arms. Without a moment's hesitation she put her arms around his neck and kissed him. The glow in his eyes mirrored his thoughts of family and home in faraway Virginia. "Lieutenant," said Todd, "it goes without saying that we are prayerfully thankful to see you, but may I ask what accounts for our good fortune in having you here?" "This detail is out of newly established Fort Mason, Colonel Robert E. Lee commanding," replied the officer. "We have been on a long scout beyond the Concho River. The plains are alive with Comanches, and there seem to be 1,000,000 buffaloes for every Indian." "Is there good land in this country which can be taken up or bought very cheaply?" asked John. "Fort Mason is located several miles up Honey Creek, which flows into the Llano from the north," said Lieutenant Stewart. "Nearby is much good land for the asking, but it's at the edge of settlement." The Todds immediately decided to settle there. The train reformed, and the cavalry troop helped the settlers cross the Llano and escorted them to San Saba land. According to Lieutenant Stewart, there were no organized Indian bands depredating in the area at the moment, so the other wagons cut loose from the cavalry escort and changed course to the northeast. The Todds built a comfortable cabin about 5 miles above Fort Mason, beside a mineral spring which flowed into Honey Creek. Their nearest neighbors were the Tom Woods family some 3 miles away, from whom John presently acquired foundation stocks of horses and hogs. On days when he was not clearing land or breaking soil for next year's corn and wheat crops, he scouted the plains, searched the valleys, and rode out the thickets for unbranded cows and dogies. Through Lieutenant Stewart's cooperation, he got the Fort blacksmith to forge and shape him a branding iron with the legend JT, which he hoped to register when time and circumstances permitted. It was of course legal and honorable to brand dogies and any other unbranded beef animal more than a year old. John Todd was in business now, and he looked forward to the future with confidence. He managed to gain a contract with the fort for the delivery of firewood, the proceeds from which kept his family supplied with commodity staples and ammunition. Settlers continued to enter San Saba land in increasing numbers, and the Comanches grew more restive. Frequent reports trickled in of a ranch family murdered and scalped here, a lone rider jumped and slain there, a surveying party ambushed and wiped out somewhere else. Among the victims was a widely circuit-riding Methodist minister named Jonas A. Dancer, who had held services for the Todds and other Fort Mason settlers only a few days before he was scalped. By the time of the fall roundup, John was beginning to make like a cattleman. He sold his 2-year-old steers and bought his family some comforts. The sale also provided money for tuition and board for Alice for the 3-month school term in San Saba town. The corn and wheat yielded heavy crops, and amid the general rejoicing, Lieutenant Stewart received word of his promotion to captain. Sarah arranged a party with a double purpose, celebration of the dashing officer's advancements, and a send-off for Alice. There arrived a moment when Captain Stewart and John found themselves in a reasonably quiet corner. The officer's manner suddenly became grave. "Between us," he said slowly, "I hope we have not staged this celebration prematurely. Judging by my mail from home, the Southern states are in a mood to secede from the Union unless they are granted certain concessions." "Do you think secession would mean war between the states?" asked John. "Let us hope not. Certainly not if the hotheads can be restrained," replied the Virginian. When Alice came home for the Christmas holidays, Civil War clouds were gathering ominously. South Carolina seceded from the Union on December 20th, and soon the other southern states joined in, but a small, prophetically wise group in Texas, headed by Governor Sam Houston, kept that state in the Union until radicals took over in February and lined Texas up with the Confederacy. In San Antonio on the 18th of the month, General David E. Twiggs, commanding the Department of Texas, signed an agreement with the Texas Commissioners, providing for peaceful evacuation of United States Army posts by federal troops. A few days later, Captain Stewart rode into the Todd clearing looking very grave indeed. He had come to say goodbye. "Everything at the fort is in total confusion," he said. "As you know, Colonel Lee has long been detached, and the new commandant acts like he thinks he should arrest somebody. Many of the officers and men are Southerners and are stating openly that they intend to defect to the Confederacy. And of course, as Virginia goes, so must I go. My point in being here is to urge you to pull out until things get stabilized again. The Comanches will get wind of our leaving, and it will only be a matter of time until they sweep down on you." The Todds were momentarily speechless with shock and grief. In her gentle manner, Sarah thanked him for his many kindnesses, and expressed heartfelt hope that the Lord would watch over him in the years ahead. John shook his hand warmly, and hoped that they might all meet again in the midst of peace. Alice, who never cried, burst into a fit of weeping as though her heart would break when the officer turned to leave. Now, Goldilocks," soothed the captain as he kneeled down before her. "You must never send a soldier away with tears in your eyes." She rushed into his arms, but continued to implore him not to leave. He kissed her ever so tenderly, set her gently on her feet, and stood up. He saluted. He turned on his heel and mounted his horse and galloped down the trail. It was goodbye, for some 3.5 years later, he lay in the mud, dying of his wounds in the Battle of the Wilderness. "Sarah," said John after the two had sat in silence for some minutes, "we've slaved to get where we are. The war which is probably coming may last for years. If we pull out of here now, there will be nothing left when we return, if we ever return. What shall we do?" "Whatever you think we should do is what I think we should do," she replied. "Then let's sleep on it and talk further on the matter tomorrow," he said as he took her in his arms. The next morning Tom Woods rode over to announce excitedly that the cavalry had indeed abandoned Fort Mason. The settlers were agog over this development, but not one was considering pulling out, said Woods. Instead, they were calling a meeting for that afternoon to plan the formation of Minutemen for the defense against the Comanches, and wanted John to attend. Woods had just ridden off when the Todd hounds set up a fearful racket and dashed toward the edge of the clearing. John looked and could hardly believe his eyes when he held a mounted squaw with a companion in white man's dress mounted behind her. After a minute's hesitation, John stepped forward from the cabin and motioned for the Indians to approach and get down. The brave held the bridle of the squaw's horse in an obvious move to keep her from dashing off as he led her up to the cabin. He was wearing a gold crucifix and moccasins instead of shoes. He dismounted, removed his broad-brimmed hat, revealing a full shock of black hair instead of the usual semi-plucked pate of the Comanche warrior. He bowed gracefully. "My name is Manuel Castro," he said in Spanish. "Naini call Manuel Loba Height, Lone Wolf. Manuel half Mexican, half Naini. Manuel wish be white man's friend." "And her?" questioned John, indicating the squaw. "Squaw daughter of Chief Buffalo Hump. Naini call her Rosie Hummingbird. Manuel call her Rosita." At the sound of her name, the young squaw raised her head and flashed a quick smile. Her thick black hair was worn in 2 giant braids festooned with bright feathers. Comanches normally force their women to cut their hair short. She was dressed in fringed buckskin ornamented with bright shells and a few beads. Her moccasins were also decorated with gaily colored shells. She looked quite clean. "Big Chief of Long Knives good friend to Manuel and Rosita," continued the Indian. "Why Long Knives leave fort?" John hesitated, not sure it would be a good idea to tell the Indian the soldiers had pulled out for good. "Long Knives go on long scout," he said at last. "Will Long Knives return to fort?" asked Lone Wolf. Now there's a question requiring a careful answer, thought John. Finally he said, "Yes, some day." "Manuel have lodge one son there toward Naini," said the Comanche, pointing toward the northwest. "Chief of Long Knives no let white man shoot Manuel nor Rosita. Now white man shoot if he find, but if he no shoot Manuel and Rosita, be white man's friend. Help Naini there." He waved in an arc toward the northwest. "But if Naini come, Manuel warn white friend." "A one-man peace treaty," said John to himself. He turned and eagerly explained the conversation to Sarah. "This represents direct help from our blessed Lord," said Sarah reverently. "You're right, Sarah. I'll tell Manuel that we are glad to accept his proposal." When this information was communicated to Manuel, he bowed in his gracious manner and replaced his hat. He turned and took down from his horse a thick roll. "For the Senor and the Senora," he said, as he handed John 2 fine buffalo robes. "For the Niñito," he said, as he offered a delicately carved miniature bow with a small quiver of feathered arrows, carrying fire-hardened points instead of flint heads. Manuel obviously knew something about the caprice of small boys. "For the Niña, Naini must never see little Sunburst," he said as he held forward an ornamented buckskin outfit complete with moccasins which seemed to be a miniature copy of the ensemble Rosita was wearing. At this moment Sarah stepped forward from the cabin. "For Manuel," she said as she handed him John's pride and joy, a keen, fine-tempered hunting knife with an inlaid handle. "For Rosita," she said as she placed in his hands her own necklace of semi-precious stones. "We brothers," said Manuel as he again bowed deeply, then turned and mounted his horse, and the 2 Comanches rode away into the underbrush. "Manuel has obviously been spying on us as he knew the makeup of our family. I hope he doesn't scalp us with my own knife," said John with a wry smile. John Todd attended the meeting of the Minutemen. The group agreed that every effort should be made to get along with the Comanches. Until further notice, no settler would go deep into the northwest country in search of strays, or for any other purpose, or do any other thing which might stir up the Comanches. But if the Comanches raided the settlement area, the Minutemen were to assemble with all possible speed, and strive to kill every raider. Thus encouraged, John decided that he and his would stand fast on their exposed ranch. Then came the fateful 12th of April, and the hotheads on both sides staged the tragically unfortunate show at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Civil War in effect had begun, but not until June 8th did acting Governor Clark declare Texas in a state of war. Governor Houston had walked away from his official chair and had gone into retirement rather than abrogate his oath of allegiance to the Union. Soon San Saba land was drained of her young men as they answered the call to arms. One morning the Todd hounds went into their Indian frenzy. Manuel and Rosita were sitting on their horses at the edge of the clearing. The Todds waved them in cheerily and signaled for them to get down. Manuel handed Sarah a buckskin bag filled with smoked buffalo tongues. "Thank you, Manuel," she said with a smile. "We are very glad to see you. Please come in." He got her general meaning and took Rosita by the arm, half leading and half dragging the nervous girl into the cabin. Inside the house, Manuel explained that he and Rosita had been on a long buffalo hunt beyond the Concho. "Niney come to Manuel's lodge while Manuel and Rosita hunt buffalo," he stated. "Leave message. Band have Rosita's brother. These cousins holding up 2 fingers. These braves holding up 3 fingers. Hunt horse, but no hunt here because Manuel said no. Hunt one son there," pointing to the northeast. "Manuel follow trail little way. Niney pass near this lodge. Maybe so see little starburst. Very bad." This information caused Sarah, busy as a beaver in her kitchen, to pause in fearful speculation. But work, prayer, and hope constituting the only salvation on this frontier, she returned to her cooking while silently beseeching divine protection for them all. She set out a feast fit for an emperor. Under her kindly urging, Rosita overcame a little of her shyness. She was enthralled with Alice and her red gold hair. The Comanches rode away shortly after the meal, proud of and pleased with their friendship for the Todds. Some 10 days later, as the sun was setting, the Todd hounds again bugled their Indian alert. Manuel and Rosita rode into the clearing and approached the Todd cabin without awaiting an invitation. This time he was armed to the teeth, white man's arms too. He was leading 2 good horses on each side of his mount. Rosita, a bow and quiver of arrows slung on her back, was leading 4 pack horses in a line. 3 were heavily laden with tanned hides and bundles of furs, the other with utensils and the remains of their knocked-down lodge. Obviously, Manuel did not subscribe to any of this slow-moving Indian travois business. "Rosita's brother visit Manuel's lodge last sun," said the Indian without preliminaries. "Say 90 council vote scalps of Manuel and Rosita must be taken, because friends of white man. Manuel great warrior and take many scalps in 90 wars. Chief Buffalo Hump give Rosita to Manuel, but now 90 no friend to Manuel and Rosita because we friends to white man. What will you do now?" asked John. "Manuel and Rosita travel by night till reach Fredericksburg, and trade horses and furs, maybe so some horses, then go to Mexico." "Ask him if there is anything we can do to help him," said Sarah. "He says we are the ones in need of help," replied John. "Rosita's brother warned that the Comanches would come for their scalps around the full moon and plan to raid this country. They know about Alice. He calls our attention to the fact that the moon is nearing the full and urges us to get out of here at once." Manuel and Rosita sadly rode away, southeast into the gathering darkness. The Todds mulled over their predicament. A check showed that the moon would be full in 3 nights. John decided that they would pull out the next day, as quickly as he could bury their valuables and round up the horses. He would warn the other settlers of the impending attack and keep his family in the settlement area near the fort until the Comanches had left the country. Everything was up before dawn preparing for the exodus. John mounted a horse held in the lot and rode forth to gather the other horses. By the time the family was ready to start for the settlement, the sun was nearly overhead. John put lead ropes on the horses and the 2 yearlings, leaving a weanling filly to follow along, and secured them to the saddle horn. Then he slung a bag of clothing in front of his saddle. He called for Alice, who emerged from the cabin decked out in honor of the exciting trip to the settlement, in the outfit Rosita had made for her. The reddish-yellow glow of the splendidly tanned buckskin matched her hair, and she did indeed resemble a little sunburst. The father lifted her up behind his saddle, while the mother did likewise with little Johnny, and the party shoved off along the trail to Honey Creek. Just as they reached the creek and struck the trail south to the settlement, a turkey gobbled upstream not far away. John froze to attention. From what seemed to be a considerable distance downstream, a turkey gobbled in reply. "Comanches, God have mercy on us!" moaned Sarah through teeth clenched in anguish. John kicked the clothing bag free and tossed the lead ropes. "Quick, over this hill," he said. "If we can get around them, we can approach the settlement from the south. I'll ride ahead about 200 yards. If they intercept us, it will have to be that band from downstream. In that case, I'll try to hold them off while you ride back over the hill to the Honey Creek Trail." The Todds had galloped about a mile down the valley, and their hopes had risen when suddenly a war party numbering perhaps 40 braves came pouring out between the fleeing Todds from an arroyo on the west opening to Honey Creek. They were hardly 50 yards behind Alice and her father. About half of the band swung toward Sarah, and John saw his beloved wife turn her horse and head back toward home. His only hope was that they would take her captive, and that he might later rescue or ransom her. The rest of the band bore down on John and Alice. John dug his heels into the mount, and the speedy horse widened the distance between him and the pursuers. Seeing this, the Comanches opened up with their arrows, and John had to zigzag his mount. This maneuvering cost him ground, and the Indians began closing the gap. Suddenly the horse stumbled, and Alice shot off to one side. The gallant animal regained his feet without actually going down, but the Indians were right on top of Todd. He escaped being lanced only because he jerked his mount suddenly to the left. He continued to arc toward the left in the now wide valley, with the intention of trying to ride back toward the band to Alice. He looked back and saw several braves holding her gleefully, but none trying to injure her. If he opened fire, he felt the Indians would murder and scalp the child. He decided that if he threw his life away now, many days would pass before this Indian outrage would be discovered, too late for rescue of his family. So he set his horse down toward the settlement for all he was worth, and under his lightened load, he soon left the Comanches so far behind that they abandoned the chase. In later days, some of the settlers censured John Todd for these actions. He galloped into the settlements only to find nearly everybody away on a community project for clearing a camp meeting ground over the Llano. It was late afternoon before he finally assembled a party of 8 elderly men and boys. Riders were dispatched east and south to spread the alarm and recruit more men. The small party bravely accompanied Todd back along his trail. No signs of Alice or her abductors were seen, but when they reached the spot where Sarah had turned her horse, they stumbled upon the remains of Mrs. Todd and little Johnny, the scalps missing from their decapitated heads. The party gathered up the pieces in a blanket and carried them toward the Todd clearing where the smoke could be seen curling up through the trees. The Indians had burned the cabin to the ground. All the horses and 2 yearlings had been stolen. The weanling filly and several pigs and cows lay about with arrow shafts projecting from their bodies. Todd's neighbors dug 2 shallow graves, and one of them mercifully led him away, while the others buried his wife and son. All through the night the remaining men of San Saba land rode into the Todd clearing. At first light the rescue party, now some 25 strong, struck the Comanche trail leading northeast toward the lower reaches of the San Saba River. This seemed to indicate that the Indians were out to steal more horses and could be overtaken. The trail was easy to follow, and the white men rode hard. As night approached, they reached Turkey Creek, which flows through what is now the famous Sloan Ranch in San Saba County. Here, beneath a tall bluff, was a much-used Comanche campsite. The murdering band had camped there the night before. On the face of this white cliff, the rescue party found 2 bloody handprints, of a size and conformation that an 8-year-old girl might have made, while leaning forward in exhaustion to rest her weary head. Apparently the Comanches had tied Alice's wrists with green rawhide, so that as the rawhide dried, the bonds grew tighter and cut into the flesh. The Comanche band apparently altered their plans, and elected to forego further horse stealing on this foray, and instead lit out for their stronghold in the northwest. The whites pressed the trail as hard as they could, but the ground grew rougher and rockier and the trail dimmer. In spite of the peril and their small numbers, Todd and his posse stuck to the pursuit right on into the foothills of the Santana Mountains, the heartland of the southern Comanches. Here the trail faded out completely. With heavy hearts, the gallant little company had to turn back empty-handed. In actuality, the bloody handprints on the cliff face were later thought to be a well-executed Indian painting, but from them had already arisen the legend of the bloody handprints of little Alice Todd. Comanche lore dealing with the closing years of their life on the open range often refers to a great chieftain who had a squaw with hair like a sunburst. Was this celebrated squaw once the lovable little daughter of John Todd with the red gold hair? So that's it for this episode. To this day, nothing is known about what happened to Alice Todd after she was captured. The story mentioned Lieutenant Stewart, who was with the federal troops at Fort Mason before the war broke out. I believe this refers to James Ewell Brown Stewart, who was stationed at Fort Mason. Stewart was a distinguished general during the Civil War. The story mentioned that he died at the Battle of the Wilderness on May 5, 1864, but he actually died on May 11th at the Battle of Yellow Tavern in Henrico County, Virginia. It is unclear whether Stewart actually met the Todds or whether this was some embellishment on the part of the author of this story. In the next episode on Unworthy History, we are going to follow this story up with an account of the same story from one of Alice Todd's classmates at her school in San Saba. Some of the details in her classmate's story differ from those in this story from Frontier Times magazine. This upcoming episode will also include some other stories of Indian attacks in San Saba and Llano counties during the same time period. This episode will be released very soon, so stay tuned to this channel for more actual history. This channel is called Unworthy History because we talk about actual history that is now deemed unworthy to discuss on history channels on TV. If you'd like to support the mission of Unworthy History, then consider joining our Patreon page or becoming a YouTube channel member. Your contribution towards keeping actual history alive will be recognized at the end of each episode, and you will also have access to special members-only videos. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.